United States of gold, British pounds on dollars, and other European currencies on pounds. And bottom line is the system just didn't work, and here's why. When Britain inflated and experienced a deficit in its balance of payments, other countries did not redeem their pounds for gold. Instead, they kept the pounds and inflated on top of them. Hence, Britain and Europe were permitted to inflate unchecked, and British deficits could pile up unrestrained. In addition, Britain was able to convince the U.S. to inflate dollars, which enabled Britain to not lose many dollar reserves or gold to the U.S. And this is where having a good understanding of the banking elite really helps to explain as to why the U.S. would do such a thing. I'm not going to go off on this too much because I want to move on, but you have to understand that very powerful men such as J.P. Morgan had taken over the money system in the United States by this time. And that was with the creation of the Fed in 1913. And so U.S. monetary policy was really now run by the banking elites. And therefore, you can bet your bottom dollar that they made decisions based on their best interests. Okay? And so when you do your research, you'll discover that J.P. Morgan was really nothing more than an agent for the Rothschilds. Okay? The family which held a complete monopoly over the central banks of Europe, with their base being the Bank of England. Okay? I'm not going to harp on this too much again, but the quote, "Who controls the money controls the world," you can start to get a sense of what's going on here and how really powerful the banking elites are. Now, the point of the gold exchange standard is that it cannot last. The piper must eventually be paid, and of course, this only came about after a lengthy inflationary boom. As sterling balances piled up in France, the United States, and elsewhere, the slightest loss of confidence was bound to lead to general collapse. And this is exactly what happened in 1931. The failure of inflated banks throughout Europe and the attempt of hard money France to cash in its sterling balances for gold led Britain to go off the gold standard completely. And soon after, the other countries of Europe followed. So now the world was back to the monetary chaos of World War I. The international economic order had disintegrated into the chaos of clean and dirty floating exchange rates, competing devaluations, exchange controls, and trade barriers. It actually was so bad that trade was conducted through barter agreements between governments competing and conflicting with one another. Secretary of State Cordell Hull repeatedly pointed out that these monetary and economic conflicts were the major cause of World War II. It was also during this time that even the U.S. went off the gold standard, off the classical gold standard, I should say. In 1933, as I had already said, FDR outlawed American citizens from owning gold, and they could no longer redeem gold, their dollars for gold. However, there was a lingering tie to gold that did remain, in which the dollar, now redefined as 1/35 of an ounce of gold, was redeemable in gold to foreign governments and central banks. Also, during this time, because of the monetary chaos in Europe, as well as war-related transactions spanning World War I to World War II, much of the world's gold ended up flowing into the United States. And so by 1950, the U.S. had accumulated over 80% of the world's monetary gold. So between achieving victory in World War II and having a majority of the gold, as well as the U.S. having its infrastructure and production capabilities intact, the U.S. was able to lead the world in coordinating a new monetary order and ultimately solidifying its position as the new leader of the Western world. Now, the new international monetary order was conceived in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in mid-1944 and ratified by Congress in July 1945. The new system was essentially the gold exchange standard of the 1920s, except the dollar was the only key currency in the system. The British Empire essentially was done by this point, and therefore their currency, the pound, no longer played a role. So the U.S. pyramided dollars on top of gold, in which the dollars could be redeemed by foreign governments, while all other government-held dollars as their basic reserve, and pyramided their currency on top of dollars. So this system, like the gold exchange standard, was doomed to fail. However, it did work for a while because all the world's currencies returned to their pre-World War II pars, most of which were highly overvalued in terms of their inflated and depreciated currencies. Since the dollar was artificially undervalued and most other currencies overvalued in 1945, the dollar was made scarce. And so the world suffered a so-called dollar shortage. In order to rectify this situation, America, really the American taxpayer, was supposed to be obligated to send out foreign aid. Anyone remember the Marshall Plan? Well, this was basically America giving money to Western Europe in order to rebuild itself, which of course it did. So with there being plenty of room for inflation before retribution, the U.S. government embarked on its post-war policy of continual monetary inflation, a policy it has happily pursued ever since. By the early 1950s, the continuing American inflation began to turn the tide of international trade. While the U.S. was inflating and expanding money and credit, the major European governments pursued a rather conservative, hard money policy. So combine this with the fact that Europe and Japan were increasing productivity, which again is real wealth, the U.S. began to run continuous balance of payment deficits. And this is really the root beginning of America going from being the greatest saving nation and producer nation to becoming the greatest consumer and spending nation, and consumer and debtor nation of the world, I should say. As the 1950s and 1960s wore on, hard money countries of Western Europe and Japan became restless at being forced to pile up all these dollars that were depreciating in value. And the U.S. really acted quite arrogantly by dismissing their complaints, believing that Europe was forced to use the dollar as its currency, and that Europe couldn't really do anything about it. Well, of course they could. Europe had legal action of redeeming their dollars in gold at $35 an ounce. So as the dollar continued to depreciate, European governments began more and more to exercise that option. And so the gold standard check was coming into use. It was therefore that we saw gold flow steadily out of the U.S. for 2 decades beginning in the early 50s. In fact, the U.S. gold stock went from over $20 billion to just $9 billion. And as the U.S. kept inflating dollars upon a dwindling gold base, how could the U.S. keep redeeming foreign dollars in gold? To try to stop European redemptions of dollars into gold, the U.S. exerted intense political pressure on the European governments, similar to what British tried to do in France in 1931, but ultimately the U.S. could not defeat the natures of economic law. So the unraveling of the Bretton Woods system really began to accelerate in 1968. At the time, London and Zurich were the epicenters of the free gold markets. Remember, U.S. citizens cannot own gold at that time. However, Europeans could. Therefore, one way individual Europeans could redeem their dollars in gold was to sell their dollars for gold at $35 an ounce in the free gold market. As America kept inflating and depreciating, Europeans began to accelerate their sale of dollars into gold. In order to keep the dollar at $35 an ounce, the U.S. government was forced to leak out gold in order to support the $35 price level. The increasing lack of confidence in the U.S. dollar led to a fundamental change in the monetary system in March of 1968. The creation of the two-tiered gold market was established. And basically, the idea was that free gold market could go to blazes. All right? It would be separated from the real monetary action of the central banks and governments of the world. Therefore, the U.S. would no longer try to keep the free market gold price at $35. And all the pro-paper economists, from Keynesians to Friedmanites, believed that gold would disappear from the international monetary system, cut off from its support from the dollar. These economists predicted the free market price of gold would drop well below the $35 an ounce level. Instead, the free price of gold never dropped below $35. And by early 1973, gold had climbed to around $125 an ounce. So, far from establishing a permanent monetary system, the two-tiered gold market only bought a few years of time. American inflation and deficits continued, and the higher free market gold price simply revealed the accelerated loss of world confidence in the dollar, and this ultimately would lead to the final dissolution of Bretton Woods. On August 15, 1971, Nixon went totally off the gold standard, and for the first time in American history, the dollar was totally fiat, totally without backing in gold. So now the world was plunged into the fiat system of the 1930s. So by replacing gold, a pure asset, with dollar-denominated U.S. Treasury debt, the global financial system became debt-based, not asset-based. And it was this move in 1971 that has led to the current mess that we're in. When money becomes debt, a liability, and government can produce as much of it as they want, the money system becomes completely unstable. We're now beginning to see the end of this global fiat debt-based experiment, and at its current pace and direction, it's going to get very ugly. Just like in the 1930s, we're already beginning to see competitive devaluations of currencies, exchange controls, currency blocks, and really economic warfare. So now I'm just going to play a short minute-and-a-half video for you guys. So just bear with me for a second as I change the settings that we're in.
The U.S. versus China, it's looking more and more like an economic Cold War, and it's not just a talking point at the Pentagon. They are planning for real economic threats to America. Our Eamon Javers has the latest on the war games that are playing out in some high councils around your parts. Eamon?
Hey, Tyler. Well, you're right. Ever since the crash of 2008, the Defense Intelligence Establishment has really been paying a lot of attention to global markets and how they could serve as a threat to U.S. national security interests. At one upcoming seminar that we're going to see here next month, they're taking a look at a lot of the issues that might be really familiar to CNBC viewers. Take a look at some of the Pentagon's key concerns here. They're looking at the use of sovereign wealth funds to manipulate markets and currencies. They're looking at nation-state economic collapse, sovereign default, and nation-state instability, and they're also worried about U.S. allies' budgets, deficits, and national security infrastructures. And in the Army, they're having a very interesting year-long exercise called Unified Quest 2011. And in that wargaming series, they're looking at the implications of large-scale economic breakdown inside the United States that would force the Army to keep, quote, domestic order among civil unrest, and force the Army to deal with fragmented global power and drastically lower budgets. This according to the trade publication InsideDefense.com. And in October, military officials from the Marine Corps war colleges visited the trading floor of J.P. Morgan to study markets and the economy. So, Tyler, you can see that all different parts of the Pentagon and Defense Intelligence Establishment are looking at markets and looking at ways they can present a new kind of threat to the United States. These are the guys whose job it is to think about the very worst possible things that could happen, and they've dreamed up some very scary scenarios here.
All right, Eamon, thank you.
We'll just go and present it one right there. How about that? So let's take a look at what's happened since 1971. Our national debt has gone from $400 billion to just about $14 trillion. Just 7 years ago, Congress raised the debt ceiling to $6.4 trillion, which means the federal government has doubled its indebtedness in less than a decade. In contrast, the entire federal debt amassed from the founding of our nation until President Reagan took office, sorry, I'm supposed to be a different slide here, until President Reagan took office in 1981, a period of roughly 200 years, was $1 trillion. So it's no exaggeration to state that federal debt is growing exponentially. And taking a closer look, we find that in the 1950s, Treasury debt rose from $257 billion to $290 billion, up 12.8%. In the 1960s, Treasury debt rose from $290 billion to $393 billion, up 35.5%. In contrast, during the inflationary 1970s, Treasury debt rose from $393 billion to $930 billion, up 137%. And if it wasn't for Fed Chairman Volcker and his decision in late 1979 to let U.S. rates be set by the markets, the U.S. dollar would likely not have survived very long into the 1980s as a purely paper fiat currency. Moving on to the 1980s, Treasury debt rose from $930 billion to $3.2 trillion, up 248%. And we can thank our fiscal conservative Ronald Reagan for that one. In the 1990s, Treasury debt rose from $3.2 trillion to $5.67 trillion, up 75.5%. And in the 2000s, Treasury debt has risen from $5.67 trillion to over $14 trillion, up nearly 150%. Since 1971, 97% of all existing Treasury debt has been created, and 93% of it has been created since Mr. Volcker saved the paper dollar in late 1979. So since 1982, all of this inflation has been reflected in serial credit-induced bubble markets, the last of which was the real estate bubble about 3 years ago now. And all that is left is the last of all the bubbles, and that is Treasury debt itself. And when this bursts, the game is up. So when you hear about gold being in a bubble, it's really not. However, it tracks a bubble, which is our debt, and that's why it's mistaken for one. And of course, the situation is really only getting worse. As you can see, our budget deficits on an annual basis are exploding higher.